to Asheville Vedic Astrology's YouTube channel, youtube.com/Ryan's Vedic Astrology. I'm here with a good friend, colleague, and special guest, Corey Dowds of eyeoftheveda.com. And today we're going to begin a small series dealing with relationship astrology. And our goal is going to be, at first, to discuss the difference between Synastry and also the Kuta points that are often used in Vedic astrology. And both of us have an agenda thinking that one is better than the other, so we'll discuss that. We're also going to spend some time talking about how gentle planets, you know them as benefic planets, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, waxing moon, and so on, how they affect relationships. And we'll do another section on how cruel planets, Sun, Mars, Saturn, Ketu, Rahu, how they affect relationships. And if we have enough time, we'll also spend some moments discussing how Rahu and Ketu specifically relate to relationships. So welcome back, Corey. It's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me back. Hey, Ryan.
Yeah. So last time we were at Ernst Wilhelm's place and we were all gathered talking about these things. The topic came up of whether, when it comes to relationships, whether the Kuta points, the Kuta report that you often get, that astrologers do, Vedic astrologers do, if that really has the impact that we think it does, or if Synastry itself has the major impact. So my thought was, and I stated this in the book, The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology, Volume 2, is that the Kuta points were actually for a whole different time and probably a whole different culture and a way of doing things. I think it does have some application if it's studied, certain aspects of it are studied on its own individually. But that what I had seen is that when you take a person's chart, chart A and chart B, and you overlap those charts and you see how the planets are impacting each other, that it is really that which makes the difference in how that relationship, how each of those individuals is going to experience that relationship. So I know you do a lot of relationship work, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I remember you telling me that, and you expressed that opinion years back when you wrote that book. And at that time, I hadn't gotten into the relationship astrology as much, so I didn't have enough experience of my own to decide. But it's been like 5 years since then, and recently in the last few months I started realizing, wow, in my opinion, I have to I guess I just agree, really. I'm basically saying that, yeah, it is really interesting how what Western astrology has been doing for some time now, basically called Synastry, that overlaying of the planets on top of each other really says a lot about like how you're going to get along with that person. And
Right.
So many other techniques you can bring into that, like the avashtas of the planets overlapping, and the lords of houses and all these things really fill in the details of relationship compatibility for me. So I am much more into that now, and I am not quite as, I can do Kuta points and all that, but I've sort of stopped feeling that they're as important.
So do you still use that then? So when someone asks you to do a relationship report, I look at the Kuta points. I pull up all those different, like the Nadi, the Yoni, the Tara, the Varna, and so on. I look at all those things. And I even look at total points as well. However, I've often seen that even if someone has amazing amounts of, like the total points are off the charts, that doesn't always mean anything. And if someone has low points, I've seen people in beautiful long-term relationships who have had, low points with that Kuta report. So do you still use that when you're doing charts?
My experience has been the exact same, where I keep seeing that, wow, these people who've been to be honest, there's not all that many good, harmonious, long-lasting relationships I have in my database, because that's how life is, right? But
Right.
Those people that have that, a lot of them will not have anything interesting with the Kuta points. It will just seem random. And we've got to remember that that's just keeping, that whole system's just looking at moon to moon. It's not incorporating all this other stuff.
Right.
And we know how important all these other planets are. And
Right.
so it is, but you're right. Like, I do look at those things and I look at the points. I do think things like Raju and Beta are important, and they do show problems, but still, like, I have colleagues and people that I interact with that I would have Raji with, that it's not the end of the world. And I've dated people that I had that with and had great experiences with them.
Right.
I do like Mahendra a lot. I think the Mahendra thing is really great and it does make sense.
Right.
But there in the last year, there were two people that I dated that had the exact same amount of points in this same Mahendra thing. One of them was amazing. One of them never, it was nothing. You know what I mean? And so it's like, that's still not enough
Right.
it's not enough variables.
Well, what's interesting about Kala, you mentioned that it's just between moon and moon. But I always found fun about Kala was that it's got a chart for all of the planets. You know, it's got the moon, and surely it's got that in bold, but you can also go through and look through that for Mars, for Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus, and so on. And I remember when we were sitting around talking, Ernst threw out this idea, and maybe you remember it a little more than I do. He was talking about using the Couta report or the Couta points specifically based on the kind of relationship you're going to have. Like, so for example, if you want to know if a couple is going to have great sex or great sexual relationship, you would specifically look at the yoni, or if you wanted to check out their fertility, you would look at the yoni. Or if you want to know, can this couple work well together? Like, as in, can they meet the day-to-day responsibilities together? He would say, if I recall correctly, you would look at the Varna points. Do you remember this?
Yeah, and he does go into how each of those has specific meaning, and I think that is. But I have to say that, so I was really interested in that when I went through his course, and I went and looked at all the yoni things, and went through the previous women I've been with, and to begin with, there's only one other yoni out of all 27 that you're going to get with well, you know what I mean, or whatever. So that mathematically doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's like saying that there's only one out of 27 women that you'll ever, no, that's not incorporating. Well, some people have just yogas with Venus that are going to make them,
right.
You know what I mean?
But what if you understand the moon? Tell me about that. Or should we save that? Should we save that for the benefic?
Let's save that for.
Okay. All right. So, well, anyway, what you were. So I have not studied his relationship course. So I was just going by what I heard him talk about briefly when we were visiting.
And there is truth, and I do think that there's validity to that, what he's saying. But still, I don't think it's really enough. And
can you flesh it out a little bit more, though? I mean, just kind of.
Yeah, because, well, just when I looked at it, and in my experience, I couldn't see that every time that yoni thing, or I do think that the Sri Dirga is important, and what he says about that really makes sense. And what he says about the nadis, the windy or this nadi or that, and there are a few others that I think made a lot of sense. It's just that I felt that, and so yeah, the yoni thing can still make sense. Just don't make that the end of all, because again, it's not accounting for one person might just have amazing yogas. You know what I mean? Or being really sexually compatible with everyone they meet, and another person might not. You know what I mean? So I do agree that it has something, but I didn't find that. I was really looking for, this explains why, you know what I mean? And it wasn't.
Right. Well, I think you brought up that good point there. Number one, it's the yogas that the individual has. But as we get further into this discussion, the idea of synastry, and what does the synastry mean again? We were discussing that.
So synastry, syn means like synchronizing and same, and astry is like astrology. It comes from Ishtar, the word name Venus and star. So it's like same stars. So it literally means like same astrology.
Okay.
Sharing the stars.
So with synastry, if you think about it that way, and again, synastry, the idea is you have your chart and you have another chart, and you're just seeing how those planets overlap within those charts. For example, is someone's Mars on top of another person's Venus? Is someone's moon on top of another person's Saturn? That will give a specific effect to the person who has the Saturn and a specific effect to the person who has the moon. But what you're discussing there, especially around like compatibility and sexuality, well, if one person has Venus in the 8th house or 7th house, and the other person has Mars in the 8th or the 7th house, and they're right on top of each other, that can be a very passionate combination based on their synastry, which means that even if the yoni didn't match up in the Couta points, well, the fact that Mars, which is that drive, that hunger, that intense kind of craving matches up with Venus, which is the fulfillment. Well, that's why Mars and Venus, when we think about them, we say one is man, one is woman. The idea is when those two polarities come together, it gives this the ability to enjoy that kind of passion. But that's coming from one person's chart over top of another person's chart, not from the yonis, right?
Yes, so that's exactly what I was trying to say. So that is one thing that's useful, but in my experience, I've actually found that the synastry thing seems to provide a lot more data and a lot more useful information.
Right.
But it's not to say that the yoni doesn't, or that those other Kuta things don't work. But I think also I wanted to mention that it's like what you were saying about the time we're in. So I think the closer you are to a more old school kind of Indian traditional culture, then the more these points and all this stuff's going to really work for you, and it's going to be more applicable. But for a lot of people, it's not as relatable, maybe.
Right. Well, I don't think people quite, I think the way people relate to others in relationship these days is really different. You know, at one point in time, there was the idea that you had a particular role in relationships, and we're not going to get into the political correctness of that, but, you know, it kind of makes sense in a way. It's like if I'm playing in a musical group, a band, I have my role as the guitar player. That person has their role as the drummer. I'm not trying to play drums. I'm not trying to play guitar. And I think a lot of that comes from this idea of, you know, there's a particular role for each individual in the relationship, rather than you have to be everything to the other person and vice versa. And that's how a lot of people approach relationships these days. Not everyone, but a good amount of people do. And I think that's why relationship astrology doesn't always work, because they're looking for information about how to get that when that's not really possible.
So that presents actually a much better side of the Kuta points to me that I didn't really think of it in that way. But that kind of makes them actually seem more appreciated.
Right, and that's why, you know, the idea of the timing makes so much sense. Like if we were in a different time where we had a different kind of way of thinking about things, maybe, yes, we would put a heck of a lot more attention to that. But for now, I mean, you know, you agree too. I think the synastry is the way to go. And we had talked earlier, you mentioned you had been looking through some charts. Do you have any charts or examples of things that you'd like to show, or do you want to save that for another discussion?
Yeah, I could just say just briefly some examples. Like it's really neat how you can seem to get a lot more specific when you use this synastry. For example, like you're saying, Mars, one person's Mars, another person's Venus on top of each other makes them get along really well sexually and seem to have good, healthy passion in the relationship. And then, but you can go even further. Like the one couple we both know, one of them's their Jupiter, their knowledge, the other person has their Rahu on it, and that person helps expand and get their knowledge out there through, you know what I mean? And
right.
There's just really a lot of neat nuances to it that I think the Vastas, everything kind of explain it. Like when we were looking at like when we were at Ernst's place and I looked at Trishti's chart and I was like, there's Ernst in your chart. You know what I mean? Like when we overlay it, and it was so obvious that I'm sure their Kutas, they had good things too, but yeah, I also even think that when you see like a important spouse planet on the other person's K2, that can indicate like an important past life karma you had with that person. And I've seen that a couple times where like, you know, the Jupiter for the woman was right within 1 degree of that person's K2 or something like that. And it's like, ooh, that is kind of odd, you know, and that could be significant. That could be a clue. Right.
Okay. Well, we'll probably save a lot of that for our next discussion. But one thing that comes to mind that I think a lot of people need to consider is all those examples you gave are wonderful, but we can do that with any planet, you know, and that's why I think it's important for us to know what each planet means and represents. You know, for example, if you have the Sun and Saturn, if you have someone's Sun, say person A's Sun in Gemini, and then you have person B's Saturn in Gemini, well, what's the experience they're going to have? Well, the experience they're going to have is that the person who has the Sun in Gemini is going to feel restricted by the person who has Saturn in Gemini. So every time they're around them, they're going to have this sense of restriction, or even sometimes harsh criticism in a way. And that's going to be almost feeling demeaning to the person whose Sun is there. possibly. I mean, of course, there are things to keep in mind. But then the person who has their Saturn there, well, they're going to feel, what's the word? Not bullied, but you know, when you have someone in your presence and they seem so noble and they're trying to do the right thing, almost shamed in a way, you know.
Like overpowered. I have that exact situation. I know of a chart where that's happening, and it's like the woman's Saturn is on top of the man's Sun, and so he can be so good, but then kind of a little thing that she'll say or something will make him feel constrained, get that constraining, constrict, and then his whole self-esteem will kind of crumble or something. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then on the other end, like the other woman in the same situation can be like, gosh, I just feel like you're telling me how it is, like this sun figure. You know what I mean? Right. And yeah, the typical Avashtas that we know of. You know?
Mm-hmm. And you're right, and that's a very good point. The idea of the Avashta, that's an Avashta.
Yeah.
Which means that if you understand how the Lajatati Avashtas work, and you see these kinds of combinations in a person's chart, you can understand what that dynamic most of the time is going to be like, you know. And sure, through conscious awareness, you can become aware of that. Meaning you can, okay, I'm around this person, we have this Avashta together. So actually there should be a whole series on relationships dealing with Avashtas. And then that also gives insight into the relationship, because if someone comes to you and says, this is my experience, it's so terrible, is this going to work out? And if you see an Avashta like that, you can just describe it to them. And then they realize it's not a personal thing. It's not that the person with the Sun is coming in and saying, I'm here to dominate you, which is what the person with Saturn feels like. Yeah. And the person with the Sun, they don't have to feel like, oh, I'm being harshly criticized, which is what they're going to feel like from the Saturn person. It's just what happens when you mix together those two energies, really, you know?
Yeah, and like in this relationship, there's a lot of other good things overpowering it. It's not like that's a real deal breaker. But it's so funny because both these people can admit that like later on afterwards, like, yeah, that was nothing. You know, it's just this subjective part of the karma that, you know, those Avashtas have a way of triggering us, it seems.
And trigger is probably the key word there, because, you know, just like in your chart, if you have those Avashtas in your own chart, when a transit occurs or a situation arises that's similar in energy or resonance, it triggers that, which is why so many people go unconscious in relationships. They think it's like a personal thing, like almost like an attack sometimes, when really all it is a trigger of a particular person's planet by another planet, which is why things like meditation and so on can be so helpful. So that's good. And I think maybe we'll conclude there, because in our next set of videos, what we can do, or next set of talks, we can focus on, say, we have benefic planets, the waxing moon, Venus, and so on. How might they affect other planets when they're on top of another? And we'll do the same with the cruel planets too. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. All right. Thanks for being with me today, Corey. And we'll continue on with the gentle planets in relationship for Vedic astrology.